So crisis happens. Amalek represents crisis for the Slanomer. Amalek is not, it's not just any crisis, it's spiritual crisis. This is the kind of crisis that happens when we are on the path, when we are making efforts to grow. The Bala Sulam tells us that crisis happens because we are not conscious of how we are interfacing with the higher realms, and the more we know about that, the lesser the crisis is. What I want to focus on is the spirituality of crisis. So what I'm hoping, and I'll start from the end, is that we, through this text and through the generative study and whatever Torah comes through our discussion, that we're able to gain each perhaps a new perspective on what does it mean to be a Klei Kodesh, somebody who serves the public in the sacred space at the time of crisis. So the backdrop for learning today for me, and I want to invite you into that, is the following. I want to be really specific. I'll tell you what's on my mind. So there's a pandemic. There are epidemics of obesity, diabetes, hypertension, cancer, anxiety, depression. We're in a sick society. There's environmental toxicity, air, water, food, home products, building materials. We live in a growing toxic environment. There's growing gun violence. There's a democracy on the brink. And there's climate change. I want to anchor this in the reality of the stresses, the kind of slow growing crisis that most of the time I deny and make do and, continue and maybe find ways to have some kind of mitigating superficial hope so I can remain sane. And what kind of, perhaps theology, I don't like the term theology, but spirituality of crisis can take us to a deeper and perhaps more helpful place as Klei Kodesh. So we will start with the text of the Slanomer, Milchemet Amalek. It's a commentary on Parshat Beshalah.
כי ידע עמלק שבקבלת התורה עתידה כל הבריאה להזדעזע ולהגיע לתיקונה הגמור. ויתבטלו כל כוחות הסטרא אחרא ממציאותם, כמו דחתו ואת רוח הטומאה האוויר מן הארץ. ולכך יצא למלחמה שלא הייתה מלחמה גשמית בכוח הזרוע, אלא בהתגברות כוח הטומאה לטמא את ישראל, כדי שלא יוכל להיות אז התיקון הגמור.
This is Parshat Beshalah, the last few sentences of the Parsha. So we read about Amalek and how Amalek is attacking the people as they're traveling in the desert. And the Slanomer is telling us here that so that once they were in the desert and they were approaching Kabbalat Torah at Mount Sinai, so Amalek is the root of the Sitra Achar of the opposing forces, or the forces from the other side, or Satan, you can say. In order to blemish the people of Israel spiritually, and he lays out the common, Kabbalistic, Luyere Kabbalah and the Zohar, that we're here on earth for the purpose of tikkun, and there will be a tikkun gamur. That means that there will be a wholeness, a completeness, a bringing together of Havaya and Shekhinah. Whatever split in the Godhead, in the in Ein Sof, will come back together into a wholeness. And our job on earth, we're here in order to bring that tikkun hagamur, right? That end of days completion. And so Amalek are representing this force of the Sitra Achra, and they know that when the people of Israel are going to get to Kabbalat HaTorah, that's going to be the moment of the end of history, of Tikkun HaGamur. And they're going to make sure that won't happen, because, selfishly, because once Tikkun HaGamur happens, then the Sitra Achra gets abolished.
ולפיכך אין השם שלם ואין הכיסא שלם עד שימחה זרעו של עמלק, כי כל זמן שהבריאה עדיין לא הגיעה אל תיקונה, אין השם שלם ואין הכיסא שלם.
Okay, so we just said that therefore the throne of God and Kiseh Shalem Hashem and the name of God will not be complete until Amalek will be completely destroyed. And keep going.
אין שום עניין שלם בבריאה כל זמן שלא הגיע אל תכליתה, ועל כן גם למעלה כביכול אין שלם.
So there's nothing whole in creation as long as creation has not fulfilled its tachlit, its purpose. And also the higher realms are not complete either until the lower realms will be complete.
ומלחמה להשם בעמלק מדור דור, היינו שהיא מלחמה של הקדוש ברוך הוא. אלא שבעולם הזה ישראל הם כוח הקדושה להביא לתיקון הגמור, ועמלק הוא כוח הקליפה בעולם המעכב את התיקון הגמור, ביודעו שאז יתבטלו כל כוחות הסטרא אחרא ממציאותם.
So he's quoting here from the Parsha, and Milchama lehavaya be'amalek midor lidor. So it is a milchama, a war for God. It's God's war. This is what he wants to point out. In every generation. What does that mean? This is God's war. Because in this world, the people of Israel are the force of holiness with the purpose of bringing the Tikkun HaGamur, and Amalek is the force of the klipot, of the shells in the world that is there to oppose the Tikkun HaGamur.
וזה עניין מצוות זכור את אשר עשה לך עמלק, וזכירת יום אשר עמדת לפני האלף,
אדוני אלוהיך,
בחורב, וכן זכור את יום השבת לקדשו, שכל אלו עניינים המביאים לתיקון הגמור.
Okay, here's interesting. He brings three quotes, and he says, and he compares them. So first of all, Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek. This is from Deuteronomy chapter 25, Parshat Ki Tetzeh, where Amalek is mentioned again, and it says there's a mitzvah, Zachor, remember what Amalek did to you. Right, so this is a matter of awareness. So we're starting to now drop into consciousness, into the deeper process. So the mitzvah it's God's job to annihilate Amalek, but it's our job to remember Amalek. All right. So then he says, Now listen, this compares to Schirat Yom Asher Amata Lifnei Hashem Elohecha B'Chorev. We were also commanded, and this is also in Deuteronomy chapter 4 in Parshat Va'etchanan, to remember the time that we stood before in Chorev, Mount Sinai, and received the Torah. There's another mitzvah of consciousness, right, of remembrance. And there's another quote he brings, Zechor et Yom HaShabbat L'Kodsho. That's Exodus chapter 20, Parshat Yitro. Remember the Sabbath day and make it holy. He's connecting all these three. Why? Shekolelu inyanim. All these mitzvot are the vehicles for the Tikkun HaGamur. They bring about the Tikkun HaGamur. So to bring about the Tikkun HaGamur, we need to remember, to be aware. Please continue.
וזהו מה שנאמר, זכור את עד אשר עשה לך עמלק בדרך בצאתכם ממצרים. היינו כאשר כבר היו בדרך לקראת התיקון הגמור, שכבר יצאו ממצרים והיה עתיד להיות התיקון הגמור, אז יצא עליהם עמלק למלחמה לשבור, שלא יהיה התיקון הגמור ונדחה את אז התיקון.
Right. Beautiful. So that is why it says, Zechor et asher aseh lecha Amalek baderech, on the way. B'tzatchem miMitzrayim. Emphasis on baderech. Right? So don't just remember what Amalek did to you, but remember what Amalek did to you while you were on the journey, while you were on the path, leaving Egypt. Now, drop down with that. What's the path? It's a spiritual path. We are on the path, right? Remember what happened when you were ambitious enough to pursue your purpose. Which path were they on? They were on the path to the Tikkun HaGamur. It's an ambitious path. It's a calling, right? The emphasis is on path. They have already left. Amalek didn't attack them in Egypt. Egypt was a different other surahs. But on the path to Sinai, that's when this happened. That's important. Then Amalek instigated war in order to obstruct basically the Tikkun HaGamur, and they were successful. And that Tikkun was indeed postponed for later. We're going to jump down to the left column, the very bottom paragraph. Starts, Zohi Ikar Klipat Amalek.
זוהי עיקר קליפת עמלק המתגברת בעיתים הגבוהים, כאשר ישראל מתעלים וראוי כבר להיות התיקון הגמור.
Okay, so the essence of Klipat Amalek is that it comes when we are at our peak. This is an opposing force that meets us when we're at our best, when we're succeeding.
ועל דעת זה הוא בנוגע לכל יהודי בפרטות, בזמנים הגבוהים שלו, כאשר הוא מתעלה ומקבל על עצמו להיטיב דרכו ומתחיל לגדול, אז מתגברת עליו קליפת עמלק למנוע ממנו מלהגיע לעולם התיקון, שלא יהיה התיקון הגמור של עולמו הפרטי, ועל יהודי לדעת זאת בבחינה ודע את אויביך.
Okay, so what he says here, I'm going to paraphrase it, is you think this is, the Torah is talking about history? It says no. The Torah is talking about our private lives, about a Yehudi befratut. This is for every person's journey in life. And that is that when you are working on yourself, when you're on a spiritual path, when you're trying to develop skills and abilities and sensitivities inside yourself, and you're starting to grow, you're starting to be successful, then the shell, the clip of Amalek, becomes strongest and tries to stop you from progressing on your personal path. And he says, and it's important to know that in the way of know your enemy.
Is he trying to say that when we really feel like we've got it, that we really don't? Or that when we really feel good about what we've accomplished, or either outside of ourselves or working on our soul, that it's at that time that we're the most susceptible to the Klipot Amalek? Is that where he's going with
I
this?
think it also is sort of poking at the height of the empire that we are living in right now. That things are falling apart around us, and all have been all along. The challenges have always been there. We never recognized it. I mean, this is the challenge of critical race theory, is actually pointing out that there's been this Amalek with us all along. And so it's not only a personal journey, but it possibly we could apply it to what's going on in our communities and in our world right now, is that we were on this path. We thought it was the right one, but it turns out there was a lot of Amaleking around in the process.
So part of the way I'm reading this is, says, well, when you think you're on the right path and then things start apparently going wrong, or there are difficulties or setbacks, it doesn't mean that you're on the wrong path. Right? It might mean, Davka, that you're on the right path, though that leaves me, at least, in this place of wondering, how can you tell the difference between feedback that you're on the wrong path and feedback that you're on the right path? Because both of them seem to be the same. And so that leads to a sense of not knowing what direction to go.
It was a pretty straightforward reading. It's saying that when you are making the attempt to raise yourself spiritually, consequently, kind of to balance that, the obstacles will also get greater. You know, that's kind of a pretty straightforward kind of a spiritual message that you hear in a lot of traditions.
That's true, and in that sense, I think the Slanomer is really laying out a piece of theology that's based on the Zohar and the Ari, etc. And I think the Baal Sulam is going to go a little bit more deeper into the anatomy of crisis and what does that mean internally. In other words, the question I'd like to frame it with the following question: I am in crisis, or we are in crisis, because as the Slanomer established, what's happening in society is also happening inside, vice versa. What's happening inside is also what's happening in society. And the question is, we're in crisis. What does that mean spiritually, right? What does that mean to about the soul of, say, society, or what does it mean for our soul personally as we're working our way through these times? And that is, and you need to know that the reason for all this distancing, and he's talking about distancing from the divine, and please, Gila, take it up.
שאנו רחוקים כל כך מהשם יתברך, ומה שאנו עלולים כל כך לעבור על רצונו יתברך, אין כל זה אלא משום סיבה אחת.
So let's stop there, just so we can keep up. So the reason that we're so distant and rechokim from the Holy One, blessed be, and that we are, which puts us in a position where we can so easily transgress her will, is only for one reason. Keep going.
שנעשתה למקור. לכל המכאובים והייסורים שאנו סובלים, ולכל הזדונות והשגגות שאנו נכשלים ובאים בהם חס ושלום.
Right. So this one reason becomes the source to all the pain and suffering that we endure, and to all the transgressions, willful and unwitting, that we fail in. God forbid. Go.
שיחד עם זה מובן שבהסרת הסיבה ההיא נפטרים תכף מכל צער ומכל מכאוב, וזוכים תכף להדבק בו יתברך, בכל לב נפש ומאוד.
Okay.
בכל לב נפש ומאוד.
בכל לב נפש ומאוד. Can you hear the Shema?
Right.
בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך. That's what he's thinking about. Okay, so with that, it is clear that when we remove this reason, we immediately are rid of all the sorrow and all the pain, and we immediately merit to cleave to her, the Blessed One, with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our existence.
We haven't heard the reason yet, right?
No, he's
okay. It didn't miss anything.
He's teasing us. That's Baal Salam. Okay, let's continue.
ואומר לך שהסיבה המקורית ההיא אינה אחרת אלא מיעוט ההבנה שלנו בהשגחתו יתברך על בריאותיו, שאין אנו מבינים אותו יתברך כראוי.
And I will tell you, I will tell you that the original reason is only but mi'ut havana shelanu, our lack of understanding behashgachato yitbarach, of God's providence upon his creatures. We do not know Oto, him, Itbarach, the Blessed One, Karaui, properly. We don't know God properly. So, but what is he telling us here? Just to summarize that, he's telling us that there's a knowledge to be had, and obviously the knowledge is Kabbalah, right? That is what he is propagating and promoting.
הרי שהבנת השגחתו יתברך היא הסיבה לכל טוב. ואי ההבנה.
Yeah, so the understanding, and Havanat is understanding, but the knowledge, the proficiency in God's providence is the source of all goodness. Keep going.
ואי ההבנה היא הסיבה לכל רע.
And the not knowing is the source of ignorance. Do you hear Buddha? Ignorance is the source of all evil.
ונמצא שהיא הכותב אשר כל באי עולם מתגלגלים עליו אם לשבט ואם לחסד.
He's saying the whole world, all suffering, is pinned on ignorance versus understanding of the spiritual works of the higher world, of God's will, etc.
וכשנתבונן היטב בהשגת ההשגחה הבאה להרגשת בני אדם, אנו מוצאים בהם 4 סוגים, שכל סוג וסוג מקבל השגחת השם יתברך עליו, במיוחד.
Okay, so what he says here, when we explore this closely and begin to zoom into to providence, to providence which is within the realm of our perception, להרגשת בני אדם, what we find is that there are 4 different types of providence.
Right. באופן שיש כאן 4 בחינות של השגת ההשגחה, ובאמת הם רק 2, דהיינו, הסתר פנים וגילוי פנים.
Okay, let me just translate that. So there are 4 categories of providence, but within those there's really 2 categories. One category is the providence that comes through Hester Panim, which is the concealing of God's face. And the second is the category of, or the grand category of the revealing of God's face. Keep going.
אלה שנחלקים ל4, כי יש 2 בחינות בהשגחה של הסתר פנים, שהם הסתר אחד והסתר בתוך הסתר.
Okay, so within the category of Hester Panim, of the concealing of God's countenance, you have 2 subcategories. One is first tier of concealing, and then there's a second tier, which is the concealing of the concealing. So concealing of God's face is actually, I just want to say, it's ordinary consciousness, right? I live in the world and I'm not aware of God's presence all the time. As I say it, oh, God is present as I'm speaking. But a few minutes ago, before I read this, I was aware of you. I was aware of the book in my hand, but I was not aware in the way of deliberate, conscious, I wasn't in the moment of awareness of God's presence. Now I am. I just lost it. It's back again, etc. That is a Hester Panim. We live in a condition of God is not accessible and available to us all the time. But then there's the concealing of the concealing, where I don't even know that there's a God. That's sort of a Cartesian, the kind of the culture of Cartesian science, you could say.
ושתי בחינות בהשגחה של גילוי פנים, שהן השגחה של שכר ועונש, והשגחת הנצחיות.
Right. So here we have the 2 different categories of the revealing of God's face. One is the revealing in the context of punishment and rewards. And that is, God is good to me when I'm good. God is bad to me when I'm bad. So I know there's a God. I interact with God, and God is like the punishing teacher. And that's a certain consciousness. And the next consciousness, Hashgachat HaNitzchiyut, is that God is this eternal providence. It's the knowing or the connection with, the experience with, that I am plugged into God all the time. My amness, my isness, is dependent on that flow, on that hashgacha. The Chara people, he brings a source in Deuteronomy, in Parshat Vayelech, where he shows where in the Torah it says V'istalti panai, haster astir panai. So he shows how that is. We get that from the Torah, the consciousness of Hester Panim, and the first 2 levels. What he's going to continue to say here, it's actually a fascinating thesis, is that in ordinary consciousness, we is the Hester and Hester Astir. So most of us all the time, we're Beinonim. This is our lives. We live in this sort of like, we live in this hiddenness, this hide and seek with God. As we develop, we go into Gilui Panim, and there are levels inside that. And he's going to talk later about Ahavat Hashem. He's going to talk about, remember, we started from B'chol Levavcha, B'chol Nafshecha, B'chol Me'odecha. So he's going to pin it on that. And that the spiritual trajectory, the growth, is into that Ava, and there's levels in that. The parallel is there's conditional loving and unconditional loving. and that's where the Gilui Panim happens. So the Nitzchiyut is the unconditional love space with Hashem, and the earlier one, the one that's the Sachal ve'onish, reward and punishment, that is the level of conditional love with Hashem. It's a crisis happens. Amalek represents crisis for the Slanomer. Amalek is not, it's not just any crisis, it's spiritual crisis. This is the kind of crisis that happens when we are on the path, when we are making efforts to grow. The Bala Sulam tells us that crisis happens because we are not conscious of how we are interfacing with the higher realms. And the more we know about that, the lesser the crisis is. And let me open it up to how does this land with you? How does it speak to us?
According to Rabbi Ashlag, the route to Messianic consciousness is proficiency in understanding God on a Kabbalistic level. And we have many Kabbalists among our Hevra, and there are many Kabbalists throughout the world, and there are many mystical adepts in other traditions. And as you know, we haven't yet reached a state of tikkun. So if I were to pose that question to Reb Ashlag, how do you think he would respond? Thank you.
I think what you're saying, Ken, is how do we reconcile all that, right?
Yes, yeah, very, very apt. Yes. How do we reconcile the fact that we do have knowledge, and yet that knowledge is not percolating throughout the world today?
It sounds like as there is a certain increase of consciousness in the world, that earlier text that said that as the consciousness increases, so do the obstacles. And we're seeing that kind of crisis happening now, that could be a way of reconciling that.
So what comes to mind is, as our systems become more and more complex, they become that much more fragile. And the slightest disruption, as we know, can throw everything out of whack. And so I'm also, what's the Torah of the United States? It's supposed to be the Constitution, right? And there's this sense of, as things become much more complex, people forget the actual foundational text of the Constitution and go off on all kinds of crazy ways, having not gone back to what was that original thrust, and also then how the Constitution is continually amended. Just building on what Mark said, the barriers towards wholeness and flow and all those words become that much more challenging.
That as systems break down and as the world becomes even more complex, perhaps another way of looking at it is that the opening for tikkun becomes even larger, that there's more opportunity to heal as the need for healing becomes more evident. So my hope is that as this appears more and more prevalent, the issues we are in appear more and more prevalent, the solution has to become even more prevalent.
So there's something, it occurs to me, Jeff, that there's, when we stimulate the immune system, we present the disease agent in order to stimulate the immune system. So there's that principle of the disease needs to be present, so we actually strengthen our correcting response to it. And in the midst of stress and depression and crisis and confusion, how do I handle that in myself, and what do I offer, to others? And the question that comes up for me is so what do the Rabbanim say about crisis? What does Torah say about crisis? So what can we learn? What's the wisdom, that brings us through 40 years in the desert?
For me, the wisdom is Shema. that it's about tuning inside, because really the answers are there, that we can find God inside of us, inside of each other. So I think that while on the one hand, things might feel like they're complex, because I feel like we're in this huge change period, huge paradigm shifting. It's like it's really hard to ground. But I think that all of this is to sort of evolve us to remember, from my perspective, it's the simplicity of what's the answer? It's love. What's the answer? It's Shema.
But I think of this, this journey through the crises that we're in as being that alternating Hester Panim and Giloi Panim, that at times we just, we see all the faces of, on Zoom in front of us. We see the face of God sometimes, and feel that love. But sometimes we just sink back into, this absence, that it is Hester Panim, and sometimes Hester Shebetoch Hester, where is it?
Okay. I'm thinking about Rabbi Rubin's question about how to be Kalei Kodesh in the middle of crisis, and I'm thinking about this story of the Israelites confronting Amalek, and remembering that they also had the bones of Joseph with them on this journey, right? The Etzem. And so I think that's a key to what, as leaders, we need, is to have with us as we're in this process of transformation, that we also need to be carrying with us that essence, that connection to kind of our essence, our inner substance, and our traditions from the past.
Also have that strong image from there of like Moshe with his hands being propped up on both sides during that, and like where the power comes from. And there might be a piece there of like the seductiveness of Amalek for each of us is the seductiveness of wanting to feel powerful and effective without asking in what service. And I think that in these times, that's also something like I want to be able to feel like I'm making a difference. But those people in the school who want to get on the school board in Greensboro, like they think that there's something wrong with the world, and they just, it's the politics of outrage. And I'm kind of fascinated, or I'm like wondering how outrage becomes a substitute for connection to the divine, or for connection to, it's a way of bypassing our numbness, to think back to previous sessions in Ohala, a way of bypassing the numbness and the not knowing by giving us a kind of sense of power and purpose that can be a destructive drug.
And this is, Ken, to your question about how do we know which knowledge, and how do we reconcile all the different advice, eitzot, and schemes that are out there. I think what Bala Sulam is telling me is what you said, Yafa, that this is time to go inside and to find not peace and love and, let's kumbaya, let's all get together and, sing songs and feel good, but to find an inner coherence about the totality of the crisis, and to be able to say, this is purposeful. It's God's war. This is Amalek. This is part of the system. This is part of how this is supposed to work. And how do I position myself in that? Bala Salam says, well, you really have to study more Kabbalah, but I don't hear that. I hear more than that. You really have to go inside to the place where you can do your Kabbalah, do your receiving. It's what Yafa was saying, what I hear. You need to go inside and be able to receive. So your message is clear. It's kind of like, I'm getting this image of, this kind of takes me back to way back when I was a chayal, when I was a soldier in the IDF, and you're out in an outpost and your connection to the world. Way back when, it was a big radio that we carried on our back, and it goes, hello, hello, anybody there? Over, that kind of thing. I'm thinking of myself now a little bit more as a spiritual warrior, where I need my signal to the boss upstairs to be really clear. Because there's something that's wanting to be communicated. And the only way I can stand in front of a congregant and be a presence is to have that signal clear right now. And then there's a question of activism. How much activism? Does it make sense? Do I meditate more, or am I out there demonstrating more? Am I canvassing, knocking on doors, or am I, doing my tefillah? That's a question for each one of us to figure out. But the signal needs to be clear. And this is what Baal HaSulam is telling us. Ken, to your question about, everybody is working on tikkun. Everybody's writing books about self-improvement, world improvement, bringing the messianic days. I think what Baal HaSulam is telling us is that the more we know how this works behind the veil, the more acceptance, the less mental suffering we'll have around it. There's something about acceptance.
Mayim rabim lo yuchlu